Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Friday everybody. I trust you've had a productive week and have a restful weekend ahead. Several viewers have asked that we discuss the Chinese decision to cancel an EU forum. Yes, we will be discussing this development as well as other important EU-China developments in the weekend episode, which will be on Sunday this week, not Saturday. So there will be no video tomorrow, Saturday. It will be moved to Sunday. My apologies for any inconvenience. But for today's video, we start with the economy. US Treasury Secretary Yellen has arrived in Beijing. While Chinese statements have indicated warmer feelings for Yellen than, for example, Secretary of State Blinken, who is perceived by Beijing to be more hawkish than his Treasury counterpart, expectations on both sides are still low, especially given the reports that more export controls from both sides are in the works. We will unpack the trip and its implications for the economy and US-China relations after its conclusion. During the trip, Yellen is expected to meet with Premier Qiang, who on Thursday, yesterday, held a special symposium on the economy in Beijing. Quote, listening to opinions and suggestions from experts and scholars on the country's economy and work, end quote, in the words of state media. Li said that, quote, sound economic fundamentals for long-term growth remain unchanged, end quote, but warned of short-term challenges to economic dynamism. As we will see, this may be putting it mildly. Yesterday, China Real Estate Information Corp published new housing sales data for the month of June. The numbers are shockingly poor. According to the data, new housing sales by China's 100 biggest real estate developers fell 28.1% in June year-on-year, and this was already against a low comparison base, as in 2022 the country was seeing many pandemic restrictions. Compared with June 2021, which is perhaps a better comparison, June sales declined 58.9%. Month on month, June saw an 8.5% increase, the slowest growth on record for the month of June. In the first 6 months of this year, new home sales rose just 0.2% versus last year, mostly driven by a low comparison base and some pent-up demand. The China Real Estate Information Corp report accompanying the data also pointed out a significant trend which we need to take note of. Among the 100 biggest developers, those who saw year-on-year growth in new home sales in the month of June were almost entirely state-owned, while, quote, 27 companies, mostly private developers, reported declines of more than 50%, end quote. Obviously, this will be very disappointing for policymakers. After 2 years, the housing market remains very, very sick. Quote, China's housing market recovery has been losing momentum since the second quarter after a brief rebound in the first. China's real estate sector is key to the economic growth outlook this year. Analysts are calling for more supportive policies to prop up the sector, such as further easing of requirements on home purchases and mortgages in large cities. End quote. As regular viewers know, however, housing is not the only systemic concern in China currently. We will discuss the banking industry shortly when we return to economic updates. But first, let's take a quick detour and talk about the weather. China, especially northern China, is currently seeing a historic heatwave, threatening water supply, electricity, health, and crops. According to state-run CCTV, Beijing reported 15 days in June when the average temperature exceeded 35 degrees Celsius, a record for the capital so early in the summer. Being aware suddenly that half the viewers are from America, let me just Google whatever that is in Fahrenheit. Let's have a look. 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Neighboring Hebei province reported a similarly record-breaking 18 days. Several deaths caused by heat stroke have already been recorded. On Tuesday of this week, the World Meteorological Organization officially declared the first El Niño in 7 years. causing Chinese experts to express concern of even more intense droughts and floods in China this year. Indeed, during the El Niño of 2009 through 2010, China saw a so-called once-in-a-century drought in the southwest of the country, at one point resulting in millions of people running out of drinking water. A researcher at the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences, speaking to Chinese financial media outlet Yicai Global, warned too that the heat wave will likely reduce crop yields due to the damage done to growing vegetables. The China National Meteorological Center on Tuesday confirmed that in the northeast of the country, corn and soybeans have already been damaged. It is believed that this record heat wave will continue well into the second half of this year. Now, let's return to the economy. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. Another massive help for the channel is just sharing this with people who you think would be interested in this sort of content. And as always, anyone who can go the extra mile and help me keep the channel financially sustainable and primarily subscriber supported, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. As always, thank you so much everybody for watching, liking, sharing, for all the support. Okay, yesterday, Thursday, at the China Auto Forum in Shanghai, executives from 16 car-making companies in China, including Tesla and China's giant BYD, signed a pledge to, quote, maintain fair competition and avoid abnormal pricing, end quote, for their electric vehicle products. State media reports that the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology directed the China Association of Automobile Manufacturers to bring the car makers together to sign the document. It would be interesting to know what some of the Tesla executives privately thought of some of the pledge's provisions, like enhancing core socialist values, for example. The move comes as the industry has been engaging in a brutal price war in the world's largest EV market. Tesla, the only foreign company involved in the agreement, for example, has cut the price of some models made by its Shanghai plant by up to 14% versus 2022. Quote, the market probably had already expected the end of the price war, as we do see pretty solid EV demand in recent months. Automakers will rely more on new models to lift sales, end quote. And finally for today's video, Goldman Sachs has caused a bit of a stir this week. In a report published on Wednesday, Goldman Sachs downgraded shares of several top Chinese lenders, including 4 major state-owned banks, expressing concern about the bank's exposure to local government debt. The 12 banks examined in the report are expected to hold a total of 34 trillion yuan, $4.69 trillion of local government debt, accounting for 61% of bank assets. The report argues that the local government debt holdings will cause potential hits to bank profits for years, as the debts will be expected to roll over at lower interest rates. Goldman also said it expects higher bad loan ratios from lending to the real estate sector. The U.S. investment bank expects dividend yields of the Chinese banks to come in at 4 to 6% this year, 2 percentage points lower than it projected before the downgrades. The downgrades caused a bit of a stir in markets. China's domestic analysts remain much more optimistic on Chinese bank stocks, however. For example, according to a CITIC Securities note recently published, quote, banks' fundamental indicators are recovering, with improving revenue and profit growth, end quote. And indeed, Goldman may be feeling a bit of heat from this Wednesday report. Undermining confidence in large state-owned banks is not something Beijing would miss. The day after the report, on Thursday, Goldman published a follow-up note softening some of its language. It clarifies that its assessment was based on 3 factors: the local government debt exposure of banks' balance sheets, their earnings risk arising from local government debt, and the impact of such debt risks on different banks. State-run The Paper, citing an unnamed source with Goldman Sachs, reports the same day too, quote, the market misunderstood some statements in the research report. Goldman Sachs did not assume local governments will default on debts. On the contrary, Goldman Sachs believes local government debt risk is controllable, end quote. And with this, let's finish today's episode with this timely observation today by Professor Michael Pettis. Quote, Goldman has downgraded many of the big Chinese banks largely because of their heavy exposure to local government debt. This has led some people to claim that Goldman is effectively predicting that local governments will default on their debt. But that isn't what they're saying. When a borrower cannot repay its debt, it can default immediately, or it can restructure the debt for many years. The difference is that an immediate default forces the lender to recognize the loss up front, while a restructuring often increases the total loss that has to be recognized. It also allows the lender to recognize the loss over many years. Unfortunately, it also tends to freeze up the lender's balance sheet and create what in Japan were called zombie banks. One way or another, the Chinese banking system will have to absorb the costs associated with excess local government lending, but by stretching out the process, the regulators can keep the banks alive as they recapitalize them through transfers. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Have a good Friday, everyone. Have a lovely and relaxing Saturday and weekend, and I will see you all on Sunday.